Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, the power of names. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff, and our guests are joining us remotely. For years, they called him Barry, the anglicized version of his African name, Barack Hussein Obama. President Obama's name embodies his cultural and racial identity, as do the names of millions of Americans of color. Bias and discrimination based on the names of job applicants of color are well documented. So is the common practice of stripping newly enslaved people of their birth name in favor of one chosen for them. Plus, the overall resistance to respecting both cultural names and the names groups claim for themselves. When your name embraces your history and heritage are deliberate mispronunciations and co-opting racist. Joining us remotely, Marita Rivero, principal of Rivero Partners. Ms. Rivero is also the former director of the Museum of African American History and the former VP and GM for radio and television at GBH. Susan X. Jane, principal at Navigators Consulting. Lamerchi Frazier, Director of Education for the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket. And Jean-Luc Perit, President of the North American Indian Center of Boston. Welcome to you all. So I want to start this way by having each of you give me the brief history of your name. Jean-Luc, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Callie. Yes, my name is Jean-Luc Perit, and I'm named after my great-great-grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Descon. My mother decided that Jean-Baptiste was a little bit old-sounding of a name at the time and decided to give me something that was a little bit more modern. At the same time, it evokes the colonial history of Louisiana, the history of my tribe, the Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana, and the leadership of my family. So,
all right, Lamerchi.
Yes, my name is the result of being named after two of my grandmothers. My grandmother maternally was Lamerchi, and my grandmother paternally was Alberta. And so looking at how those names evolved, it is following a creolized name link to Louisiana, West Virginia, and Florida. So these names were creolized as they began their lives. And it was passed on to me as a part of the family legacy. And now my daughter's name, her middle name is my name, just to keep it going. So it's an embrace of our history.
Okay. Marita.
Well, the Rivero is my Afro-Cuban grandmother and father, who came to New York when he was 8 years old and just stayed here. He kind of merged into African-American life in the United States, married a Black woman from Richmond, Virginia, and she thought she'd make up a name that fit Rivero. So she made up Marita, which I always thought was Spanish till I went to Puerto Rico or somewhere. And they said, what kind of name is that? Is that Swedish? So I would say the Black American part is my middle name, Joy. If someone calls me Marita Joy, what are you doing? I know that they're from that part of my life when I was a little girl. Most of those people, the Marita Joy people, have disappeared. So I'm now Marita Rivero.
Okay. Susan.
I named myself after a divorce, so people should know you can change your name to whatever you want it to be. I had been an Owusu. I had also been a McDonald, and I had a couple names that I never knew because I am adopted, so I had some names that were before my time. And so when I had the opportunity to, I changed my name to my mother's name as my last name. I wanted to take a woman's name, and I put the X in the middle as a recognition of all the names that I had and the names that hadn't been known to me.
Okay. So now let's talk about, why this is important, why these names are important to people of color. And Jean-Luc, I'm going to start with you again, because you referenced the history of colonization in Louisiana. And you said really what your name is now and even today is not the original name of the tribe. because of all of these pieces of activity around who was subservient and who wasn't in that time. So explain.
Yeah, I think that, actually, when we look around at the landscape, even when we reckon where we are, Massachusetts, we have places like Shaman, we have all these different Indian names that persist. And yet for our peoples, for our families, we had to adapt and adopt colonial names, names that were made French, names that were made English. So definitely there are things that it kind of speaks to sort of the cheapening of lives, while sort of the extraction of resources and land was the main thing. So what retains identity.
And Susan, you say that this kind of shaping of one's names from outside external forces, now in your case you got to rename yourself, really is about reinforcing boundaries of what people, other people outside of your group or yourself, think is normal.
For sure. I think that having all of these different names, there was always a mismatch between how people saw me as a biracial Black woman and how people experienced my name. And so I think names have a really powerful place in helping other people to decide how to treat us from the moment they meet us.
Lamerchi, Susan had said earlier that she named herself and she claimed herself. There is a history in the United States with Black folk trying to take back the power of their name from coming to these shores by enslavers and being forced to accept other names, and then moving to come up with names that reflected either their community in some way or the Africanness. Talk to that a little bit.
Yes, I think that there is quite a space that is claimed intentionally, this intentionality of taking on a name or renaming yourself. And that can be historically evidenced in a woman who ended slavery in Massachusetts, her case in 1783. Mom Bet was what she was referred to. And as she was freed in that court case, she renames herself Elizabeth Freeman. She is announcing that she is free, and that is her status, and that is what she wants to be known by. So this consideration of the spaces that we occupy and the identity politics that are amiss because of colonization, slavery, and all of the other spaces that we are in and defined by others. It is the opportunity to make a reference to your own birthright, your right as a human being, to resist those forces of oppression and claim your space. And I think that as we go into the contemporary times, that this is still a practice by parents to assert some power in their child's life of giving that name recognition, honor, respect, all of those things that we think about in terms of being in control of our lives. And so having the opportunity to do that, we can even think about people like the evidence of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass Washington Bailey was his first name that he had. He was born given that name. And yet, as we know him as Frederick Douglass because he chose to change his name a couple of times. Mm-hmm. And it asserts that responsibility of you to take on what may have been a shameful history as a reparative history. So,
and speaking of that shameful history, as it were, I think one of the most powerful scenes that in both books and on television was the series Roots, in which you actually saw what the transformation of Kunta Kinte was Alex Haley's original ancestor being forced to change his name. So he was here, part of the journey of those people who were enslaved in the United States. Alex Haley talked about his story. We're going to show a clip from that series, and it's a little tough to watch, but I think you'll come away with a sense of how important this was. And the scene is played by actor LeVar Burton, Kunta Kinte.
Your name is Toby. I want to hear you say it. Your name is Toby. You're going to learn to say your name. Let me hear you say it. What's your name?
Kunta Kinte. So, there is the evidence, and there was, Marita, to your point, there is the power in demanding the acquiescence of taking on another name, rooted there for many ways, and continues as we are living today in current times. And yet, you gave a great example of when you want to know how to pronounce what may seem to be an unusual name that is attached to a person of color. You learn how to do it by the basketball player Giannis. Let me see, Antetokounmpo. Yes,
Antetokounmpo.
yes, I almost got it. So talk to me about that power dynamic, because that's what it is.
It is a power dynamic. We see from sportscasters and sports fans that you can learn a Greek name carried by a Black man if you want to. So I think the idea that you can simply toss off, I don't know actually how to pronounce the vice president's name. I'll just call her Kamala, we don't know, whatever it is. It's an expression of control and of deciding you're not going to allow this person into your world. I think the Nation of Islam most famously kind of addressed this directly by saying we don't have these names. Our name is X. And later we might be given a name. So people are always really struggling over that piece. It's heartbreaking when you read stories of young people, and we all were young people, who don't want to come back at that, who don't want to correct people, who are prepared to go through time. A young Ghanaian person came and stayed with us several years ago, and he came as Ebenezer because he'd been in a British school in Ghana, and everyone was given a British name. Of course, when he came here to Mass Art and said his name was Ebenezer, Americans started laughing. The only Ebenezer we know is Scrooge. So it was a joke. Anytime he met any American, oh, Christmas Carol. And finally he said to himself, wait a minute, my name is Mate. And he is somewhere in there at the end of his freshman, he said, I'm Mate. You can forget that Ebenezer stuff. And he thought, what was it about Mate that was so difficult for the British in Ghana? It's still that opportunity to really impose yourself on people. I found as a child that I kept looking for my name on, keychains and the cups, and there was never a Marita. And after a while, I liked that. So there's no Marita. You're just going to have to deal with it. You're going to have to learn how to say my name. And I think that is a point that people come to as they grow and embrace many names, nicknames, whatever it is they're dealing with, geographic places, their own family history, marriage, single name, married name. People are negotiating that through a lifetime because it's part of how we identify. And other people always want to be in charge. Somebody might want to be in charge of how you identify. Mm-hmm. So that's that struggle. Who gets to decide who you are? And
well, let's just call it, that's racist, right? Because I don't see that as much in any other place. I think one of you indicated, well, here we are in Boston, when the Irish came and they wanted to keep those ties. They have Gaelic names we just adjusted to. Nobody says, that's a funny name. Why is it Celtic Sojourn? Why is it Celtics? They just went with it. But when it comes to names that are attached to folks of color, it brings up suspicion often, Susan. And this plays out in the workplace as well.
Absolutely. We know that there's discrimination from the very beginning of people's contact with companies from those names that are on resumes, that there is a significant difference for people who have names that sound like they belong to people of color, having challenges, getting callbacks, to the point where some employers have started to create what's called blind hiring, where they remove the name from resumes in order to screen them, because the idea is those names of color create create bias from the very beginning. But the problem with that is then we're screening out part of who people are and part of what they're bringing to the workplace as a value, their lived experiences. So we're really still struggling in the workplace with finding ways of really recognizing people and also controlling bias at the same time.
Now, in this scene in the comedy Blackish, the debate, what you were talking about, Susan, ensues as Dre, played by Anthony Anderson, chooses a name for his unborn son.
You're not serious about naming our kid Devontae, are you?
Yes.
No.
What exactly is your problem with that name?
It's unconventional, Dre. I grew up as Rainbow, okay? Rainbow, that was not easy.
Yeah, that's because Rainbow is the name that white people give Cocker Spaniels.
Stop it.
Devontae is a great name. It has cultural significance.
Devontae is the name of the least important member of Jodeci.
No, the least important member of Jodeci was Mr. Dalvin, and you know that.
No, I don't.
There's a different reason that you don't like the name Devontae.
What?
Yep. It's because it's too black.
There you have it. Jean-Luc, I want to broaden this to talk about the issue of mascots and Native Americans, because now we're talking about co-opting cultural history through names. And and a lot of times people have been struggling around, some people know what the reason is, but others have been struggling around, why is that important? Just, it's just a sports game. It's just why is that important? So when it comes to co-opting a name, why is it just as harmful as dismissing or mispronouncing?
Co-opting with the claim that it's doing honor. And when we're talking about mascots, when we're talking about imagery such as what's on the current seal and motto, due for revision after the work of the commission, we've seen so much of our bodies as people of color represented as composites, decoupled from names. And so when we're looking at the seal and motto, and we're looking at Native mascots, we're looking at a misconstruing of identity. And we're saying that this is something that does not do our community's honor.
Al, someone is going to be watching this saying, okay, I guess I get it, but in the end, does it really matter, if somebody is trying to pronounce your name, they just can't get it, it's just too weird, I can't to them. Can't you just get over it, Lamerchi?
Well, I think getting over it has a lot to do with not only your individual identity, but also a collective identity. The idea that this is, looking at what Jean-Luc has just iterated, that this is a collective responsibility to keep honor, to keep integrity, to keep traditions in place, rather than ignore them, because, as Susan said, the value that you bring can be ignored by dismissing the name. So with this idea that the dismissive and discursive attitude about a sports team being named in a way that is destructive, it is really violence that is perpetrated on a group of people who don't identify with that as being proper to uphold their traditions and their practices and the honor of what they are on the earth. And so I think that this is a space of the aesthetics being the beauty of what people bring in their culture, is a space that we should think about being honored. We have had this, we looked at a continuum of ugly to beauty, what is has been deemed ugly by European people is the African and the indigenous. And so the Black Power paradigm was to change that and flip that whole thing, and Black is beautiful being a moniker of the aesthetics of Black and indigenous people being now honored by flipping that and saying that the beautiful rests in the people who have honored their own traditions and kept their beauty and their aesthetics in place. So I think this colonialization of the aesthetics and the imagery of that has been claimed even in the images we see on television and other places reflects that mentality of possession. Mm-hmm. And then the response to that now being a resistance. And so I think that is what we need to really admire and honor about the challenge to what has been the taking of people's names and the misuse
of a name. So Marita, speak directly to the folks that say this is political correctness. We didn't worry about that. I don't remember having to say this and that. It seems to me that I went to school with all kinds of folks of color. People had nicknames. They were Mike. They were Molly. What's wrong with that?
And the idea that you don't choose your own name is just preposterous, isn't it? And let's talk about just names for a minute. When my son was, let's say before kindergarten, let's say 2.5 or something, I said, oh, somebody's coming over with their sons. You're going to get to play with Alexander and Christopher. He just fell out laughing. The only names he knew were Raul, Jamal, Sabe, Nadira. Christopher, he just doubled over and rolled on the floor. Never heard a name that funny. So I think this idea that there's some group of names that are somehow sacrosanct. How many ways have you spelled Sean in Ireland, please? I mean, Eastern European name. So this idea that one group of people, again, can decide they're going to choose what everyone else does. It's just, it's not worth it. It's like, come on. I think the easiest thing to do is to simply ask somebody. We all do that. How do you pronounce your name? Or again, it might be, I just forgot what you said. Let me write this down. How do I say it phonetically? If you intend to learn a name, you learn a name. That's what you do. You don't keep mispronouncing someone's name. The new president of Lincoln University changed her name from Gloria Marshall to Niara Sudarkasa. And then being introduced by an alum, noted alum, whose nickname was Tick, by the way, Dr. Tick Coleman. He must have pronounced Niara Sudarkasa 4 different ways, coming into this thing. And when she stood up to speak, she said, thank you so much. She smacked women. Thank you, Dr. Tick, or is it Tack Coleman? And the whole room just fell out. So, I mean, I think this idea that anybody is going to start ignoring who you are needs to be set aside in the interest of just good manners. If I say I don't want my team named X, and I have a whole community of people behind me and people who sympathize with them, you say we want to see that Indian bonnet, the feather, whatever you all call it, chief, all the names that go along with the fact that redskin, all of that. We don't want that. This is what we want. That has to be acknowledged and respected.
Susan, would you add to that?
I think names are about power. And so when we think about using Native American names in a country that has perpetrated a genocide that remains unrecognized, it's like we're scooping out the culture and removing all that it is and just taking away the part that people might want to retain. And I think, especially as we think about American culture, if you can say it long enough, then people will believe it to be true. And so the power to use names in ways that are really disconnected from values or culture are a way of exercising that power of erasure. So I think it is really important for people to think about who has the power to make those names. Marita talked about in schools where a Ghanaian student had to change his name. We have to change from the African name or the Chinese name. You never hear people in America being given a Ghanaian day name. Well, I'm just going to call you Kojo or Kwesi because that's easy for me. And those are pretty easy names to pronounce. Instead, we learn to say names like Shishevsky. And that is about who has the power to decide what will be present and what parts of culture we'll get rid of.
Now, are we at a time where that seems to me to have shifted, where there is, as Lamerchi says, that's part of the resistance, Jean-Luc, where people are like, no, this is my name. That's not what it is. And you may not make me Johnny, because my name is Jean-Luc.
Correct, because we're at a point where we're tired of the assimilation agenda. For Native Americans, the United States was actively at war into the 20th century, and we didn't receive citizenship. Not every Native American was able to vote until the 1970s. Our religion wasn't even recognized as free until 1978. So now we're at a time where we're healing our wounds, revitalizing our traditional knowledge, our culture, our languages, and we're having a new consciousness of identity, decolonizing ourselves, and hopefully working towards systemic structural change.
And there are now very specific ways in which folks of color are moving to be intentional about that resistance in figuring out how to push back against the disrespect and the erasure. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, because this is the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. Thank you for joining us. And if you want to hear that part of the conversation, stay with us as we continue our conversation on our digital platforms, Facebook and YouTube. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. We are on Facebook and YouTube with our post show, continuing our discussion on the power of names. Folks have gotten pretty sophisticated now about, as Lamerchi described, the resistance. Now, Lamerchi, one of the ways that way back when, even and not in modern times, and I want you to put the context on it, that people were a part of this resistance of enforcing who they were, was, as you said, with Frederick Douglass, but also with Phyllis Wheatley. Can you tell the story of Phyllis Wheatley?
Well, Phyllis Wheatley is from the Semi-Gambia region. She's about 6 or 7 years old when she's kidnapped from that part of West Africa that we now call Senegal. And her language was Wolof. As she is brought into Boston after a 60 to 90-day journey across the water, she is arriving here, and the Wheatleys want a servant girl, so they go to purchase her at the dock in Boston, in the wharf. And rather than recognizing her given name by her parents or even asking her about her name, they name her Phyllis after the ship that she's arrived on. So perpetually, her name reminds her of that journey. And it is one which she is named Phyllis Wheatley and does carry. And as she writes her first published manuscript, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, she announces her status and her name and identifies herself on that frontispiece page and says, that book by Phyllis Wheatley, Negro servant of Mr. John Wheatley in 1773. It's published in London, but it is that status of, at that point in her life, not being a free person that she actually is placing under her name. And so this idea that after that, she is also married to a Mr. Peters after the publishing of that book and many other pieces that she has written. We have very little information about her marriage to Mr. Peters and her status as a married woman. So the change in her identity becomes one that is not acknowledged, is still connected with this idea of possession and not the sovereignty of her being her own person and her personhood as an author and a contributing member to society. And this fluidity with which African-American, or people of African descent were faced with at that time, during the time that she is in Boston in 1773, 1776, that era, there are many names that are identifiable as a collective: colored, Afrique American. There is always this question as to how we will identify ourselves. And in her own writing, she writes Ethiops, because at that time on the map of West Africa, it is Ethiopia that she is at, that area she's from, not in the east of Africa. And so this fluid identification of who you are, and it is always like in flux, and trying to identify yourself within that paradigm is a challenge. So,
well, I think the point that should stand out to most people in that story is that she was named for the ship she was brought over on, in which she was enslaved.
Yes.
And as all of you would agree, if that's not violence, I don't know what it is. But
Yes.
there were some intentional later on, because since we didn't have control over those names, as we saw in the Roots clip, that folks took to try to force the dominant culture to respect their children. So, Marita, talk about the naming of children with certain honorifics.
I mean, I think it was so important to our forebears that we be allowed some presence. Our children were often named what? King, Prince. We know these names. Queenie, we've heard people say that. Reverend, Mr., for example, to really get around that problem of always being boy, girl, or having an 80-year-old addressed by their first name. And I think the problem with any of that is that you're not just ignoring the name. You're actually, if you're hired, even hired, you get past the hiring, you're in the job, there's an assumption about you that's coming along with that name. It doesn't stop there. And it often diminishes you. It often puts you in a spot of either lesser authority in the job. The person before you had this much authority, you come in with your name and you have X amount of authority. It influences the way people relate to you on the phones and in general in your communications. So it's a kind of external and visible example of the way you are being approached by other people. And it's some of it feels so deliberate. My younger brother's name is Juan. So he grew up with people calling him Warren. They just couldn't understand it'd be a Warren. This was years ago, but a Warren? No. The best was someone called him One.
Oh my God.
Juan Rivero. I was called Marta Robo. So I think there's something really deliberate in deciding that you're just not going to pay attention. That's the external manifestation. What's really happening then begins to clothe itself in all the racial tropes we know and behaviors that people have. So you're really addressing something much deeper, much more systemic when you talk about my name. Pay attention to my name. It's not an aesthetic consideration.
Mm-hmm. That was made clear in a 1967 film that was called The Heat of the Night, with actor Sidney Poitier portraying a Philadelphia police detective investigating a murder in a small Mississippi town where local law enforcement questioned his credentials. Take a look.
Well, you're pretty sure of yourself, ain't you, Virgil? Virgil, that's a funny name for a boy that comes from Philadelphia. What do they call you up there?
They call me Mr. Tibbs.
I mean, that says it all. I will have to say that for me, my little small act of resistance is constantly, I only give my last name. And when people in this culture, as you know, we try to be very casual, the American culture, I do not allow it. So my last name is Crossley. So in Starbucks, what's your first name? My last name is Crossley. So I just act like I can't hear. So you're going to put Crossley or you're going to put nothing. And that's how we go. And then for those people who have the temerity to then see it on a piece of paper and decide that they will call me by that, I then correct them. My name is Crossley. And because I'm just not having that. Jean-Luc, you mentioned something, and you and I have a similar Louisiana connection. I have a lot of relatives from there. My folks are from the South, Mississippi and Louisiana. And when my niece and nephew were young, people were like, "Oh, just call us Mary. Just call it." No, they will not, because no, 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 no.
Mhm.
And you talked about how that was, very much a part of that respect was drilled into you as well because of that.
Yeah, yeah. And I wanna also recognize some of our other panelists with Creole roots in their identity.
Hmm.
But also, I just remember very, very vividly my grandparents. I had two forms of schooling. I had going to public schools where my mom's own colleagues would tell her that Native Americans no longer exist. And so I had to watch my mom fight her fellow teachers for our own identity. And then when my parents decided it was time, then I had my second form of schooling, which was being sent to my grandparents' house, and then going to the reservations in central Louisiana, in the center part of Mississippi, and meeting all of my elders, my aunties, my cousins, and even when it was an elder that was a cousin, it was like that honorific of like cousin Mary, yes sir, yes ma'am, things that I like, it's instilled, and I carry that with me today. And I can say, like, even just those experiences of having an elder, regardless if I know him or her or not, if they're family and they're sitting next to me and I say yes ma'am, yes sir, it gives me this sense of stability. It gives me a sense that they know who I am and where I am, and I held them in that regard.
Hmm.
So yeah.
And Susan, the whole question of the deliberate, either again, misuse or lack of use of honorifics around academic or other credentials is also something, as a way that when Marita was talking about assumptions being carried about you are less than. So it may say there that you are a PhD, but you can't get that respect if you're a person of color. It becomes a resistance thing. Talk about that.
We know that Black women attain degrees at the highest rate in the US, but they seem to have trouble with people recognizing them as doctor. And so thinking about those honorifics, for years we didn't have those honorifics. Just this weekend, I had somebody call me girl in a restaurant. And so that really persists still, where we have trouble calling people by something that confers them status. And for some people, they are unwilling to recognize the status of Black people in this country, and the status that they have attained through hard work. And so we don't see those doctors or those Ms. or Mrs. or Misters. Those get dropped because people are unwilling to recognize the expertise that those honorifics confer. So especially for Black women in academia, there's a lot of challenge in being identified correctly, and having people also invest in you the kind of respect that you have earned.
Now, I want to bring up something else that is probably having an impact on this conversation. It's not race necessarily, though there is an overlap. It has to do with gender fluidity and how the folks who are demanding that they have the right to claim a gender fluidity also are demanding the right then to name themselves outside of gender constructs as we know them. So it seems to me that even though that is not about the race piece that we've been talking about, it could in fact, along the way, put pressure on the same set of external forces that have long had power or dominance on determining how they will address folks and with what name. Marita?
I'm into this one very deeply because my godchild's son told her when he was 5 that he was a boy, and he was changing his name, and he was going to be called Leo. And she said she is a wonderful, supportive mother, but on that name thing, she said to me privately, does this mean I don't name my own child? Parents get to name their children, you know? And she wanted another name that would kind of offer him some options as he grew older. He was adamant, my name is Leo. And I learned from him. I really learned the importance of all those things, signifiers, that come into play when we're talking about identity. And a significant one is name. And I've learned that I'm learning how our responses have to be to acknowledge that with pronouns. How do you wish to be identified? How do you want to be identified? That's a simple enough question. The answer is the response also is to listen to that and remember. It's like learning a new name, to listen and remember and consider the frame that's coming around you. So I think it's an important moment for all of us to replay things we've taken for granted as we've grown up.
Is that going to move the needle along many of the issues that we've been discussing, Susan?
I'm not sure. I think we've seen over and over again that as rights expand for some groups of marginalized people, it doesn't always trickle all the way down through the caste system to make sure that Black people are treated with respect. I think that we've been at the naming point before. If we think about the 70s, there was a lot of embrace of African names and a lot of pushback and resistance to that. So now as we find ourselves in another era of that, I mean, it's hopeful. And I think that's what's really important about inclusion. When we start to move the needle for some groups of marginalized people, it can move the needle for others. So I'm hopeful. And we've seen time and again that rights for some groups of marginalized people don't always necessarily translate to more respect for Black people in this country. But I'm hopeful. I know many trans young people who have changed their names. It's very simple to ask somebody, how do you want to be referred? And Marita used that term signifier. And I think it's important because people are giving you a signifier so you can better understand what it signifies, who they are as a person. And as our internal world is able to align with our outside world, I think we feel more integrity. We feel more integrity when we communicate with people. So I hope that those changes that are happening can become more widespread and include Black people. And white supremacy is pretty pernicious.
Okay, last thing. We just experienced a historic moment in Michelle Wu becoming the mayor of Boston. And earlier this week, when she was sworn in as mayor, the first Asian American to be elected. Here's what she had to say.
The first time I set foot in City Hall, I felt invisible. But today I see what's possible in this building. And I see all the public servants raising us up. Frontline workers, first responders, teachers, bus drivers, building inspectors, city workers. I am deeply honored to work alongside you, and I ask everyone to join me in expressing our gratitude for your service.
So, as she was being sworn in, somebody noted here at our place that everybody on the stage with her were people of color. With her comes her card as mayor has 12 languages. Her name, her title translated into 12 languages. That says to me that with her presence there will be many people with names that some people might call unusual. And there's an opportunity for folks to just get used to it. And Susan, I know you said you're hopeful, but you haven't seen it, necessarily come down to the rest of us. Lamerchi, what do you say? Is this a hopeful sign?
I think it is that the narrative that has been so much in place and dominant is now expanding. It is, and it is a question of belonging. Who belongs here? This space that we all occupy has to do with a sense of connectivity, and that this is a moment of reckoning with a past that has mislabeled people, that has tried to erase them, and now a surge of looking at a name and culture as document. A name is a document. It signifies time. It signifies a place. It signifies the opportunity to assert one's own self as a certifier and the signifier, as Susan and Marita have talked about. This is a moment when there is a field of being able to take the opportunity to say what does really matter, what and who really matters, and the accounting for all people with this time, and particularly emphasize those who have been the attempt to erase them being at the forefront of that voice being asserted.
Well, it sounds like a good place for us to stop. I want to thank all of you for joining me in this conversation.